Well, Rhonda, why don't we begin just talking a little bit about what you do, what you're working on.
Thank you so much. So I am a law professor, have been so for 21 years. So I work with young people who are preparing themselves for a really challenging profession at a time when the world is challenged in so many, many different ways. So I teach classes like personal injury and torts, but I also help those who are in training to enter the profession really attuned to the needs of the particularly vulnerable and marginalized populations that they will come in contact with. And that brings us into issues of social justice, right? Looking at how law, how politics, how we all, in one way or another, might be more able to meet the needs of those who, by virtue of their identities, whether they be women, racial minorities, sexual orientation minorities, people with disabilities, how it is, in many, many other ways, categories as well, but how it is that those identities and the groups that we in cultures form around identities make people sort of extra vulnerable to the kinds of suffering that we as human beings always face. And so part of what I've been doing then is bringing mindfulness and compassion practices specifically and directly to bear on the very sort of subtle ways that we have been trained and acculturated to see each other through these lenses of difference, and then to discount the value of some or overvalue others. And so bringing mindfulness directly to bear on that, the personal, the interpersonal, and the systemic collective ways that, again, some of us are more vulnerable than others, depending on the context. That's what one of the things I focus in on.
Jon, one of the things you talk about with mindfulness is moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. And when I was thinking about this panel and thinking, well, what is mindfulness? How does this play with race relations and social justice? I mean, it does it is that moment-to-moment, sort of being aware moment-to-moment of one's own biases or the awareness of what one is thinking or feeling, or judgments one is making.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So the non-judgmental doesn't mean that you won't be very judgmental and have tons of judgments. It means that you'll be aware of how judging we actually are, and how carried downstream often we are in those moments. And we heard from General Pyatt how, critical it is to not do that in a dangerous environment, because 1 second wrong, apprehending of the circumstances, and it's life and death. Exactly. And that's not just true in the military; it's true, everywhere in a certain way. That there, and so one of the things that I have realized over the years that I did not realize for 50 or 60 years, I would say 60 years at least before I started realizing it. And I grew up here in this city, which is very multicultural and multiracial and everything else. And so I'm like really familiar and intimate with the landscape. What a privileged upbringing I had, and how little I actually saw my own lack of awareness about other people's lack of privilege. And it's something I've just come to realize. So it's a kind of relevant aspect of life that, although I've practiced meditation for over 50 years, was just not part of my repertoire, or it was merely intellectual. Mm-hmm. And so I begun to sort of feel how important it is if mindfulness is, as I believe it is and needs to be, not just about having a nice little stress reduction experience for yourself so that you can just be a little bit calmer or healthier or whatever, but that it's actually the lifeblood of the society and of the human species to survive the next 3 or 4 generations, that we need to actually realize the full dimensionality of our humanity before we lose it to artificial intelligence, robots, and everything else, that we need to be able to be adventurous in that field where what comes up is fear or othering, us versus them. And we have history of it in this country, which goes back to the original genocide of the native people and then 400 years of slavery. And when I grew up and went to Stuyvesant High School and learned history and everything else, it was all like, well, yeah, that's in the past. Now we have, this great society. What I didn't realize is how that woundedness is multi-generational. It ain't in the past at all. It's right here, right now. Plus, we don't learn the history of it in history. In American history, we do not learn the history of racism, of what happened after the Civil War, where Reconstruction offered these incredible possibilities, and then everything in the politics and the justice, so-called justice arena, worked against, like creating laws that prevented a true integration of blacks into society. So these are things that are part of the field, so to speak, of moment-to-moment non-judgmental awareness, because awareness itself is boundless. And to me, it feels like it's the most important curriculum for us human beings to actually engage in while we have the chance. And I think these next 2 or 3 generations are absolutely critical to recognizing how much commonality we have and how beautiful the differences are, the others, whether it's, sex or gender or race or whatever, that there's a huge amount of beauty in it if we can recognize our own fear, recognize those impulses to kind of recoil or to other you quickly,
So how do you get your students sort of thinking about that, or to do that? How do you get us all to do that?
Yeah. Well, if we just, I think, pause and really become present to what we know already in our bodies, in our bones about these things. We, all of us, come into this conversation with a tremendous cache of information, lived experience. We each enter into this conversation from some particular positionality in the world, from contexts. And so what I often do, whether with my students or with workshop participants, is just name that which is true, which is that while on the one hand, we come to gatherings like this because we know there's something radically beautiful and interconnected and interdependent about what it means to be alive in this moment, and we want to kind of learn how to do that better together. We know there's something beautiful about common humanity and real. And at the same time, we know that each one of us has lived a completely, radically unique, unrepeatable life, set of circumstances to get us here. And so, a lot of what I do is sort of invite students to move from the place of the basic practice of awareness and attending, which we've been exploring here since the opening meditation last night that Jon led us in so beautifully. That basic practice of attending can be brought to bear, as we know, on absolutely every aspect of our lives. So there are personal practices that we are committed to, and many of you in the room are committed to as well, those in the room electronically as well. Mindfulness practices, compassion practices, starting from a foundation of those, then recognizing the interpersonal dimensions of those, how it is that from those places of awareness, we can explore more richly who we are in relationship with each other. So often I use a definition that I learned from Jon and have sort of seen revised by other teachers in certain ways, but basically mindfulness is being present in a particular way with as little judgment as possible. I always say to my law students, because they're going to judge, with as little judgment as possible, with an attitude of kind acceptance, of friendliness for what arises. So if we start from that kind of present sense-centeredness, in a way, and open that up to encompass everything that we know about this moment, then we realize that we are here in these particular embodiments from each of us, all of us. We've lived, again, radically unique and beautiful beyond measure, distinct lives. I know this without knowing your whole full stories, that they've been radically beautiful and distinct, and I can learn something from each of you. And I trust that if you're open, you know you can learn something from me. So it's this recognition that this openness to the moment, and I use the term long now, broad and deep now. So the now then can include some of your kind of relative history in the social and cultural world. So
conditioning.
And the conditionings that come from that. So we bring mindfulness to just that, looking at our experience, but putting it in having the courage to look at the embeddedness in a world. We're embodied and embedded in a world, in a context, all the time. So that the particular aspects that may trip us up, the things I get attached to, the things that I feel free around, the delusions I have, they are partly constructed and shaped by the particular life pattern I've lived, and yours will be different. So creating the capacity to see through those mindfulness practices and to do it with compassion. Because we've all suffered, let me just say this, I think we've all suffered enough, period, full stop. We have. And we've definitely suffered a lot around these identity issues. So for me, bringing mindfulness to bear on the social justice work is in part about radical love as a foundation for what we're talking about. We do this out of love. We know we've suffered enough, we want it to end today. We don't want to create any more suffering for other people. I don't want to look at you and minimize who you are or minimize who you are because I've been biased to do so by my conditionings and culture. I have been hurt and traumatized by taking risks to connect with people who look differently from me, and yet through mindfulness, I know I can rise, I have risen, I have healed. I know, and not only through mindfulness, there are a lot of practices that we can import to do the work of healing that I think is a part of this. But mindfulness is a part of it, and compassion definitely a part of it. So the personal practices, the interpersonal practices, that support us in really engaging with each other from this place of love without the fear that is often so dominant, from a place of being healed from the traumas that are real in this world. We are truly more vulnerable because of these things, these dynamics. But we can heal, and we can create spaces where we do that. So I bring the students together, we begin to practice, and we open up the personal, moving into the interpersonal dynamics and aspects of those practices, so how we mindfully listen to each other, tell stories about our histories and our family backgrounds. We find out immigrant stories, and we make space and time to hear from each other about those things. And through that process, we're building trust. We're healing. We're recognizing that someone will take a moment and listen with, meaning not just listen at and listen to jump in there, right, as we've talked about, but listen for empathy, listen for connection. And from there, we can then develop projects of, allyship, coalition building, working on each other's issues as needed. I use this concept that we borrow from the sort of critical social justice world of rotating centers, meaning at some point I will look to those who are immigrants. I'm not an immigrant, but I recognize that in this time, those who are coming into the American context from a place of recent immigration may be vulnerable in ways that I am not. I'm going to attune to, because I've spent some time in this place of healing and developing the capacity to put aside my biases, I can attune to put your situation in the center for a while and be an ally and build coalitions with you, trusting that at some point you will put my particular cisgendered, petite Black woman particularity and the particular struggles I face, you'll be willing to put that in the center. And we rotate and we coalition build from that place of love that can include everybody.
You're blowing my mind. That's great.
This is what we can do. This is why we came here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You talk about listening, which I think is so important, and I thankfully was not just waiting for you to stop talking so I could start talking, because I was just genuinely listening to you. But I do think so much of, as a young reporter, the mistakes I made during interviews was I was just waiting for the person to stop talking so I could ask the next question, which I'd written out the night before and was so proud of, and I wanted to get to my next question. And then you realize at a certain age, it doesn't matter what you've written out. None of that matters. What matters is what the person is saying, and all you have to do is listen and throw the piece of paper out and just listen, and you will learn.
And you'll know how to respond.
Yes, yeah. But I think that's I think listening is such a hard thing because so many of us do want to tell our own stories
Yeah.
and get that in and be seen and be heard.
Well, what could be more interesting than the story of me? Story.
Well, actually, I think my story.
Story.
But actually, when it comes down to it, it's my story.
There's a beautiful. This reminds me of a line of from Rilke, from the great German poet Rilke, about relationships. Okay, and so it's relationships like not just necessarily man, woman, but father, son, or child, parent, or anything.
Yes.
It goes like this. Once the realization is accepted that even between the closest of human beings, infinite distances continue to exist, a wonderful living side by side can arise when they succeed in loving the distance that allows each to see the other whole against the sky.
That's great.
So that's a practice. That's not like a nice line of poetry. That's like, you can be aware of how much we don't want to do that because we're so self-focused. It's all about me. And when you're aware of our narratives, we're living in the narrative of me and we're missing the real you, the real me, because we're in the narrative. And your story is so beautiful because I've been on the other side of that kind of thing where reporters are asking me questions that they have on a list of questions. And I know, I can
There's nothing
see
worse.
they haven't heard what I just said, and then build on that so that we could actually have something that illuminates the conversation we're having. Otherwise, why have it? But it's
You can literally see it in their eyes, and you can see their lips moving, like, because they're actually practicing the next question they're going to ask. And there's nothing worse to talk to someone like that because you're like, why am I even saying anything? Because
you're going through the motions, and it's play acting. But then, as Thoreau said, you live your life, and then all of a sudden, at the moment that you die, you could actually wake up and realize that you hadn't lived because you've been doing that your whole life.
Well, it's like the old Peggy Lee song, Is That All There Is?
Yeah. So the other, did she do It's Now or Never too?
Apparently you're not very familiar with Peggy Lee's oeuvre, but you should Google it. It's quite a good...
What about It's Now or Never? Did she do that
yes.
too? Or?
But so I mean, you talk about recognizing biases. That's not a simple thing.
No, it's not. Which is why the foundation in mindfulness and compassion is essential. Research has shown that having this ability to be kind to ourselves when we're noticing ourselves out of alignment with some image we have of ourselves, right? We don't want to be biased, we're not racist, we're not sexist, whatever it is, right? We're pro-immigration, we're woke, whatever it is, right? We have this image of ourselves, and then we notice ourselves, right? Flinching when we hear somebody speaking in a language that we didn't expect somewhere, right? Where'd that pro-immigrant stance go then? Or, crossing the street and pulling ourselves in when somebody who is of a different racial background, an African-American male, let's say, we've all been trained. All of us have been trained to kind of react in a way that suggests that we might be threatened by a person who is racialized, black, and gendered male in a certain kind of context. So having the capacity to meet ourselves with some kindness when this happens is essential. First, if we can't do that, we won't even acknowledge that we're doing it. I don't know if y'all know anything about this. But the tendency, right, to not even acknowledge that this is a part of our experience, actually it comes from, the harsh judgments we have and we've internalized about. Again, we want to be liberal, we want to be considered, evolved in a certain way. And so as much as we want to do that, as the research has shown us, all of us carry biases. So if you are committed to this image of ourselves, and we as a society have been committed to an image of ourselves as well beyond all of this for at least, 60-some years, right? At least, right, the 60s, we started to really get beyond all of this. And so it makes it hard to actually acknowledge how pervasive all kinds of biases, racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, immigrant xenophobia, right? And on and on and on. They are in us, like the water and the DNA of who we are. And that can be a moment to recognize that it can often come with a lot of shame and like a lot of cognitive dissonance. No, it's not. It's in my cousin, but it's not in me, right? It's in certain institutions. It's not in mine. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our communities. We owe it to our children and grandchildren and the children yet unborn to really get serious about and mature about recognizing where we have work to do, and we definitely have work to do, about creating a culture which is truly one in which all of us can live with some sense of dignity, some sense that we can be seen, we can see each other rightly, and we can be seen, and that we can thrive, we can all thrive. This question of for whom is this mindfulness work is a real one. Who is this for? Is a real one. And people like all of us are being met with that question more and more and more. Who are you here to serve really? And if we look around the room and ask ourselves who's managed to be able to be in this space and who isn't here? What types of people, what groups are not represented? There's like an access to mindfulness gap, right? We got to address that. Let's just say, if we don't address it, we will talk. Someone earlier was talking about not being relevant quickly. The rest of the world is quite aware that they are often not in spaces like this, meaning the world itself is obviously much more diverse than Western mindfulness often is, the communities in which we gather, and even this one. And so if we want to be relevant, if we want to actually be a part of these conversations that are going to shape the future, we have to close this access to mindfulness gap. And there are many ways to do that. But one piece is to demonstrate by our fealty to these practices and our courage in bringing them to bear on these kinds of issues, looking at ourselves and doing the work we need to do to be better. That makes us more trustworthy for those who might look into a room like this and say, I'm not sure this room is for me. So there are ways that we can use these practices to actually build trust in ourselves, to be able to look at our own biases, to respond to the first piece of the question. We can look at our own biases through compassion, through mindfulness, but we need to do that together. We need each other. We need to do this in community, because that's where we'll get that extra sort of rub of, oh, wait, let me help you see, if I may, a blind spot that you have, and please tell me where I'm blind, where I can't see, where I need to grow. And so practicing in community and building trust and trustworthiness is something that we can do, and I regularly do it, but it takes time.
And it also takes resources.
And resources.
A lot of these things, it sounds all great, but where are the resources to do that? And
time is a resource as well.
So we have our work cut out for us, I would say, on a societal level. We heard yesterday from the people working in the juvenile justice.
Gabrielle.
Gabrielle's talk that for the Lineage Project that it's toxic to even walk into a courtroom in this city. Or really in any city. And depending on who you are, it's a lot more toxic or a lot less toxic. But even if you're a lawyer and you're white and privileged in certain kinds of ways, it's almost like, dare I use the term, it's stacked against you, because the laws themselves need to be looked at from the point of view of the privileged power structure that actually wrote them with certain kinds of implicit biases in mind. So that's part of how it's institutionalized. And then no matter how just your case is, you're not going to get justice, because the laws actually are sort of slanted in the direction of privilege of a certain kind or assumption of guilt. So that's why, having a lawmaker here last night on the stage, Tim Ryan, we need to actually restructure or take a deep look at how our laws actually support this kind of othering and this kind of implicit bias and a sense that I belong, but I don't really belong. I'm not, it's clear that I don't really belong unless I sort of thread the needle in a certain way that's not me. Then that's outright social disease. And it's a source of enormous amount of pain and trauma and anguish. And I think that those of us who are white, we got our work cut out for us in a certain way because we could ignore that very easily. Those of you from other countries, of course, this is not just about black, white, or the sort of racial makeup of a particular country. But for those of us who are Americans, we really have to start allowing our awareness to hold this kind of element too, because otherwise we're living in a fiction. Meanwhile, we're telling ourselves the other fiction that, oh, we're kind of enlightened and we don't, we can deal with stress and it's all in how you are in relationship to it. Yeah, until you run into institutionalized laws that make it actually impossible for you to get justice or satisfaction.
The whole idea also that we all have these narratives in our head that we're living out, and it's something you've spoken about before. I think you said in the past, who we think we are is not who we are.
Yeah.
And that's been so important to me, and it's something I think about all the time. But I do think we all, it's like when you meet somebody new and you start to, you go on a date and you start to tell them your story and you just start to repeat this narrative that is this well-worn narrative. And there are times when I'm like, maybe as I go on too many dates, but I'm just sick of repeating this, and I don't even know if it's real anymore because it's just something I say.
Yeah.
The Buddhists would say that it's empty of intrinsic self-nature. In other words, it's a narrative, it's a story, it's the story of me. But you could tell that story 50,000 different ways depending on the impression you wanted to make and so forth, and you know that, and it's not who you are. So what I say is actually that mindfulness of these narratives that come up in the mind constantly, my failure, my success, my future, my past, the whole thing, bring mindfulness to the personal pronouns and to the entirety of the narrative, and then ask yourself, is this actually true? Am I the story of me, or am I the awareness that can hold all of this and see that the awareness is much bigger than any of those stories? Then you have the opportunity to do exactly what you were saying, throw away your notebook and be present. Listen, attend, respond instead of react. Be fully present. The other person, of course, reads that, feels that deeply. Feels seen, met. Some weirdo over here sitting, connecting with you, and and maybe between that kind of weird energy or whatever it is, you see another human being. You read it, maybe it's like, I thought that might be threatening, but maybe it's not. And then something else emerges. And when we do that, and right after 9/11, and I wrote about this, that I heard this on NPR, that right after 9/11, all of those barriers fell in New York City, and there were a few days, I wasn't here, but tell me if I'm wrong, that people were relating in full presence to each other.
Well, I'd spent the first couple of years as a reporter going to war zones, and and it sounds or disastrous, and it's going to sound odd, but one of the things that drew me and continued to draw me was that sense, that feeling of it was real, and people look you in the eye and they slapped your hand hard, and all the bullshit was swept away. It was gutted, and it was often in the midst of trauma. But being in New York after 9/11, for me, it was very akin to being in Sarajevo, in the siege of Sarajevo.
And people were really there for each other. And there was a friendliness, and we're all in this together.
It was extraordinary.
Well, I got news for you folks. We're all in this together. If you go to the moon and look back, as the astronauts did the first time, you realize, hey, it's one planet. And there are no lines on it saying United States of America and North Korea. This is human beings. We're all, evolutionarily speaking, we're kind of still Stone Age, humans with nuclear weapons. And you know, we need to fine-tune this instrument pronto. And I don't know of a more powerful way to do it than meditation practice, and in particular, moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. If I did, I'd be doing that rather than what I'm doing. Yeah. But that's the challenge when it comes to the topic for today.
Yeah, and these identities, the trainings around our identities, the kind of idea that the narratives that we hold about different groups and different tribes are, you know, kind of real in a certain really deep sense. Those trainings are deeper than we realize, and that's, I think in a group like this, I want to sort of emphasize that there is this risk of bypassing, right? Because we come together and it's so beautiful. We can see each other in a certain way, and we know we're all in this together, I think, many of us. We're sort of coming to a place like this because we understand the urgency of now, that we have to work together. What gets in the way, though, of doing that consistently and effectively, of doing the hard work of asking, how are the resources being distributed? What community is going to be more vulnerable as climate change unravels its massive hurt on humanity? The hard work of turning toward, like, you know, what are the infant mortality rates in San Francisco or Madison, Wisconsin, and the wealth disparities and the racial and other natures of those things. The hard work of turning to those things is our work too. We don't get to bypass that because we have developed a commitment to these practices and way of being in the world.
And we're also loving.
And we're also loving. We are loving, and we have to want to do this work. You have to want to do this work. The good news is we can do it, that there are those out here who will link arms and hands with you if you stand up and say, I'm looking for somebody to have these hard conversations with. I think ideally we find real communities where we can have real conversations, and as one of my sort of teachers in the world, John Paul Lederach, who is an international peacemaker, retired emeritus. I don't know what that means to be an emeritus peacemaker, but he's one of these people who's had a career traveling the world trying to bring peace. And one of the pieces of advice that he gave me and some others at a conference not too long ago where we were co-presenting about these issues is, he's like, there's a way we can solve these things. You're not going to hear what I have to say. We're like, tell us. He's like, you have to begin conversations. And I would add, from this place of mindfulness and compassion, begin conversations with people with whom you think you don't have much in common, and be willing to stay in that conversation for the rest of your life. So that speaks to this long, deep, and broad now. It's about intergenerational commitments, because
it's like a Thanksgiving dinner that just never
It doesn't end.
Oh, Lord.
Exactly.
I'm not sure I signed up for that.
There are ways we get through the dinner. Pause.
Well, it'd be a great mindfulness laboratory.
Right, exactly.
But it's you know, it doesn't necessarily seem like the thing we want to do. But if we're going to survive, you know, there's joy actually also in those Thanksgiving dinners. It's not always joyful. But that we, you know, can actually find some way of seeing each other's humanity and letting down our guard, you know, because that's a part of it. We're going through the life kind of guarded and not wanting to be vulnerable. And there's so much of the trainings about bias and, you know, all of the defendedness that we carry. It's coming from that place of not wanting to live in a place of vulnerability. And because discrimination and bias means that some people are systemically more vulnerable, like asking everybody to try and be more vulnerable doesn't sound, again, it's like, wait, where's the exit to that? And yet, if we can't find a way to acknowledge we are all vulnerable, that is what it means to live in this world today.
Totally.
And yes, some are more vulnerable than others. And we can listen to how you're more vulnerable sometimes than I am in certain contexts and places. That's what mindfulness and compassion can give us. The capacity to see that we actually are all suffering. It's not like there's an Olympics and we have to measure, you know, who's suffering more, and only when you're willing to acknowledge that I'm suffering more will I listen. It's who's in a position to listen with compassion more at this moment. And sometimes that's going to be me. Sometimes it's going to be you. And so it's this lifelong path. This is how I see these things. That actually mindfulness and compassion practices is for this, like this topic, these challenges. Yes, we do whatever we need to kind of get ourselves ready in a spa-like way and support ourselves, heal our, not just spa, but heal, so that we can do this work that actually I think if we can't figure out how to do, the planet will tell us when it's ready to
If you don't mind my saying
off.
so, and putting you on the spot,
Yes.
you're embodying exactly what we're talking about. That, when we don't live this as a philosophy, but we live it in an embodied way, as you said earlier, then it immediately has an effect because it's authentic. It's recognized as authentic. We are like super fine-tuned instruments for recognizing authenticity and inauthenticity. And when you can rest in awareness in this kind of way, you're beyond vulnerable and invulnerable because there's a whole different dimensionality to your beauty. And then it's not a problem to see the beauty in the other rather than other them and distance them. So I think that, I'm very happy to be part of this particular conversation at this moment in time because I feel like the world is starving for this, that we have got to get this, thread this needle in the appropriate way, or we will live in perpetual delusion and mindfulness will become a kind of caricature of itself if we're mindful of certain elements of life and we don't want to turn the lens where the pain is.
Yeah.
That's great. Do you want to end with anything? Or?
I think we should. That sounds good to me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.